Cool.
Hello and welcome to a very special Rangers Review interview. I'm Jonny McFarlane, and today I'm joined by author and historian Martyn Ramsey to talk about his new book, Revolution 1986 to 1992. Martyn, welcome.
Thank you, Jonny. Good to be on, and for the illustrious welcome there. I could get used to
that. Well, it's great to have you here, mate. I think anyone who's been on the Rangers Review website for the last year and a half will be well aware just how good a writer you are and what they might be able to be expecting from this book. And having read it, I think it definitely lives up to my expectations, and they were pretty lofty. So I would advise anyone out there to get their hands on this. And I'm going to stick a link into the comments there so you can get fired in and get one ordered up, because when this book comes out on the 14th of March, I think you're going to want to have it in your hot little hands. But listen, I'm not going to continue with the platitudes. We're going to talk about this book, and we're going to drill into some of the themes and some of the detail, because it's fascinating, Martyn. It's absolutely fascinating, very thought-provoking, and there's a lot of things I think we should touch on from the media to the culture, and trying to contextualize some of the things that have been brought up in this book. And I think this will probably drive a lot of debate within the Rangers support, and presumably that's what you were hoping for, certainly with some of the chapters.
Me? Certainly not. No, it is this period of Rangers history. It's the first of two books. The second one, hopefully, about for Christmas, which does 92 to 98. So this huge, rich period of Rangers history, the greatest era, really. And if you're plugged into Stephen Miller's accounts, any of them on any social media platform, you will see something from this era every single day, probably. And yet, as we found doing the podcast series Dominant and Over in Heart and Hands, that covered this whole time, it's maybe not as well remembered or as well understood as we maybe like to think. And that was the greatest challenge, and the greatest reward, I think, from doing it was to start contextualizing a lot more of this, because it's very broad brushstrokes, I think, our history of it and our memory of it, I think.
Yeah, the way it erodes in the collective memory is quite interesting, and that's one of the themes of the book. I hate to go a bit Mrs. Merton on you, Martyn, but I think it's needed. You're of a certain age, I think, whereby this was obviously an era that absolutely captured you in your very soul. And it's a little bit like what attracted you to the millionaire Paul Daniels to Debbie McGee, So I assume that this was an almost soul-capturing series of events for you as a young lad, and it really captured your imagination, and that sort of sense of the vivid reality of living such a successful and captivating period has made a strong impression on you as a person as much as anything else.
Yeah, I think so. I've mentioned this a few times. I'm the luckiest, or part of the luckiest Rangers generation there has ever been, because, well, I would certainly argue, even though we still take it very seriously in adulthood, hence why we're sitting here on a Saturday morning talking about it still and do it every day, it's still not as all-encompassing as when you're a kid, and when you're growing up. You don't have perspective when you're 10, 12, whatever. There's no exams yet. There's no kids or careers or mortgages and marriages and sex, drugs, rock and roll. All that's still very much in the future. So it's really just the Rangers. And I was, a lot of my pals were, I'm sure you were as well, just obsessive about the detail. You absorbed everything in. And so those highs and lows were more impactful. And there were lows, obviously. I mean, it wasn't just this procession all the time. And I think that's one of the interesting things about doing this. It was chaotic. However, my first memory of Rangers literally was the arrival of Graham Souness. That's as far back as I can really go. And I was 17 and a half years old before I knew how it felt for a season to end and Rangers not to win a trophy. And that's your whole childhood and adolescence just enjoying success and therefore expecting that this is what football is and what Rangers is. And that's a double-edged sword, I guess.
Yeah, I wonder what impact that's going to have on this next generation of Rangers fans that we are now the fathers of kids, but largely men our age who went through this, who are going through their own epoch, a very different one, and the alignment of these different experiences and how it reflects and changes and shapes Rangers supporters of the future. I think it's going to be a very interesting next few years on that basis. I think we're already seeing on social media the beginnings, the flowerings of some quite interesting societal elements around the Rangers support based on this kind of dichotomy of a generation like us that were so lucky to experience so much success for so long, and then a generation who's now come along that haven't.
And I mentioned the Stephen Miller thing. They're constantly reminded that this is what Rangers really is. This is what Rangers really is about. And this is what history does, I guess. Well, is it? The Rangers, the dominant team in Scottish football, the most successful team, blah, 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 55 league titles and all of that. A lot of that is because of this era and Struth's era, which is a bygone age that no one has any real touchstone to. And those are two very kind of separate concentrated periods. Of course, there were other great Rangers teams, but a lot of that feeling of superiority is kind of made up by that. And what was interesting when doing the research around 1991, I think, Mark Dingle was writing in Follow about Celtic fans complaining that they'd gone just a season or two without success. And it's kind of, oh, God love them. Imagine going through that. How about going through 5? How about going through the 10 years that we had just kind of gone through before Souness? And it was quite spiky and underdoggy and not really Rangers. But by the end of this period, of course, that feeling of superiority is reinfused, and it's just that this is what we do. That's been a long time now, and I do wonder, and I do pick up that tension online with a generation who are desperate to experience what we did and what we say Rangers should be, what Rangers is, and it's quite a tension. I think you're right.
Yeah. One of the themes that really grabbed me throughout, particularly in the early chapters, was the notion that we always make history inevitable after the fact. There's a great quote from John Gregg, I think it's 1985 or 1986, where he talks about the cyclical nature of Scottish football. And I've heard that kind of sentiment, that kind of mentality over and over again. And it's easy to ascribe that narrative now, looking back. And to be fair to John Gregg, he was making it in the moment. But you point out, and I think you're of the opinion that that's too easy. I think the book does show that none of this was inevitable in 1986. It could have been derailed, and there was a lot of factors that went towards the success that perhaps are a little bit unheralded. But just on that inevitability of history after the fact, what are your thoughts?
The big wheel, isn't it? No, I don't subscribe to it completely anyway. Given the size of the club, and given there's only 2 clubs in this country anyway of that kind of size, I understand why that is so seductive and why people that makes sense. You have your time and it will come again, and just because it's sporting gravity, Johnny. I mean, what goes up has to come down, and Celtic at this minute in time that can't last forever. So the chances are that the Rangers will be the club kind of waiting and ready to take on that mantle at some point. But you still have to get your decisions right. And certainly in 1986, Rangers, the idea that you're just kind of waiting for your time in the sun, and all you have to do is just be there, I think, is the illusory part. There were other clubs in the mix at that time because Scottish football allowed other clubs to be in the mix. And what Rangers did, and the way that this revolution was created and executed, meant that disappeared, actually. Those other clubs have never really had much of a sniff since then. The prologue to the book is quite big, actually, but I felt it really, really important that you get these three things that had to happen for this to look the way it did. Rangers would always, I think, there's some inevitability about Rangers, winning a title or winning a few, but the 10 years, 12 years that followed, no, I don't think there was anything inevitable about that. And it was Heysel, it was UEFA's response to Heysel, keeping that open-ended, not making it fixed. And they would just review it every year, which creates uncertainty upon more uncertainty, which Rangers could exploit. It was the board, this internecine bickering for years and years, and with these kind of competing blocks of relatively equal power. And Celtic had that too. That's what would really cause Celtic problems getting into the 90s with these family blocks. You have no dynamism. There's no freedom, really. A deal gets done, and Lawrence Marlborough becomes the first, majority shareholder, and can then just entrust this chief exec, David Holmes, with this power. Just go and do it, and go and do it was the thing. This absolute dynamism, and Liverpool, given Kenny Dalglish the player manager. The player manager in 1985 was something that old pros did just to bridge a gap somewhere. Johnny Giles, I think, was the player manager of West Brom in the 70s. It was a kind of old, outdated, old-fashioned thing. It was not for a club the size of Liverpool to do, and yet they did. And anything that Liverpool did in 85, 86 was kind of as much of a guarantee of success in football as you possibly get. So, David Holmes said it came to him in a dream. Other fans had kind of suggested it as well. Why don't we get Graham Souness to do that? That doesn't arrive unless Kenny Dalglish is winning a double or on his way to win a double with Liverpool. So these three things, for example, have to be in place for what happens. But Rangers had to grab it. They had to be ambitious. They had to have vision, and they had to show a lot of courage, not just to chip away and win the odd thing, but just to completely change the rules. And that's what they did.
I thought that quote from Graham Souness, I think it was in the Only a Game documentary, was remarkable, that he would like to become Rangers manager. I'd never heard that before, Martyn. It's completely passed me by. I don't know how, because it seems quite an important one, and really, really interesting that he was almost, because Souness is a smart guy, he's kind of laying the idea out ahead of time, isn't he?
Well, I guess he is. I think it was a throwaway. This was recorded in Cardiff in September '85, before that ill-fated qualifier that Jock Stein died at. And it was about money, really. It was about professionalism and why Souness had never played in Scotland. It was a part of a series. But that series was never aired until the May of '86. It was before the run up to the Mexico World Cup. So no one had seen it. It wasn't going out in autumn '85. But yeah, it's obviously in his mind. And again, only because his pals do it. And I want to do that as well. And there's no way that thing enters anyone's head if Liverpool haven't done it already. I don't think. With Dalglish, they're friends, but there's always one-upmanship there.
You mentioned David Holmes, and to me, that's one of the best parts of the book. I really like that this figure from Rangers history has really been given his place in the pantheon, and you really give a strong idea of how big a part he is in the change that takes place and in the drive for modernity. And a lot of that is undoubtedly, I think, to do with the way he managed the club and what he brought to the club. Why do you think David Holmes is a figure that's kind of fallen out almost of the narrative to some extent? And do you believe that statement I've just made is actually fair, that you've placed him back into the narrative?
Well, I hope so. He shouldn't have been out of it, but he doesn't, unlike his successor, for example, did not seek the limelight. I think he enjoyed it a wee bit more than he professed he did, but he certainly didn't seek it out. It wasn't what he lived for. He actually preferred being chief exec rather than eventually moving up to chairman, because it meant more of that front-facing, public-facing thing. So that's really why. But Jonny, it's only 10, 15 years ago, it was common to read on message boards or maybe on social media that, David Murray brought Graham Souness to Rangers, for example. That absolute myth, which obviously wasn't true. And Holmes, this kind of gentle, quieter guy, in comparison, certainly comparison to Souness and Murray after him, just didn't go and kind of grab that himself, and that's a real shame. But that's the way the media works, as you know. But it is a story that needs to be told more. He was first in, last out. His car would be there at 6 o'clock in the morning, for example, tirelessly thinking of new ways to increase revenue. Literally himself, Campbell Ogilvie, I think Freddie Fletcher, just looking at the main stand, building plans. How can we get a hospitality suite in here? None of them were architects, but the three of them just, sketching out bits and pieces. And so it became, and in a way that we'd never seen in Scotland before, not to that level, not to that extent. Just being prepared to do things a hell of a different. The wage cap, for example, it's about 350 quid a week. Ali McCoist would have been on. The reserves were not on much less than that, so it kept a real tight code display, and ripping it up for Souness first of all. Then, of course, Butcher and Woods, and it was just vision and ambition that this is how you've done it. Well, that really hasn't worked for us, and the family atmosphere. People talk about that quite a lot. That him and Betty would be in that hospitality suite every week, talking to everybody. The players would feel part of something. Their wives felt part of something. There'd be a creche at Ibrox during the week. And when they won that first League Cup, that first Skull Cup, everybody was back. Every employee was back at Ibrox to celebrate. So that was him. That was creating something that things hadn't been done well. I think it's fair to say, Jonny, before he arrived, and it got stale, and it got very lazy and just scrappy, and that was not a word I think you could associate with David Holmes.
You mentioned the guy who went on to take over from him, and it's really interesting from a historical point of view. This book is covering a period where David Murray essentially walked on water, certainly from the outside looking in. If you had criticised David Murray openly in a newspaper article, and you talk about quite very, very interestingly about some of the articles that were coming out at the time, and we can drill into the detail on that as we progress in this discussion. But if you were to have criticised David Murray in those days, you would have been very isolated, I would suggest, because he created a culture around them. How difficult was it from a historical point of view to try and go back and look at Murray in an extremely balanced light, given what we know now? Maybe putting in the seeds of what was to come, but given the perception of him at that time was so vastly different to perhaps how we view it now.
I don't think it was particularly difficult. The seeds, yeah, I think that was something I was interested in. We know how this particular story ends. That's not my story. My story ends in 98. But other warnings, and there were, as that corporate governance disappears and disappears and disappears. And I think Campbell really talked about pre-Holmes, there would be a board meeting every week, and the agenda would hardly change, and it was very officious and it was very stodgy, but they had to have it on a Tuesday, and it was just that form for the sake of it kind of thing. And you get to the end where Murray's telling the Scotland on Sunday or whatever, we have a board meeting when we need to, but we see each other at games. If something needs to be done, and someone phones, and we sort it out, which is of course irresponsible. You have this great balance, I think, between Holmes and early Murray, where there is dynamism and there's ambition, but it's rooted in reality for a start about where Rangers are, where Rangers can go, and it is accountable, and it is done kind of properly. And you're right, what is important, because we do know how this story ends, but it's important to know that it wasn't always like that, and history's full of stories of that nature where someone looks kind of godlike and they eventually become very, very human indeed. And but what interests me was even in Fall of Fall, some of the most vociferous critics of Murray that would be the most vociferous critics as the 21st century dawned, and there is criticism of him throughout, but it's almost backed by he's still one of the best things to happen to Rangers. And these are people who would go on to absolutely lambast them and protest and whatever, and are criticising here, but they feel still the need, even by 97, 98, they still feel the need to say, but he's one of the best things that's ever happened to the club, because he was still the public face of a club anyway that was operating well. He's still bringing, he's still convincing people in 1997 to give Rangers 40 million quid. We're still doing sponsorship deals with Nike that are 11, 12 million pounds. And well, why would fans ask too many questions when it's been successfully, used at that time?
Yeah, to jump back a little bit in the sort of narrative, I just want to look at the hurricane that was Graham Souness in 1986 and try and place it in a sense of time, because I think now it's quite difficult if you weren't there to fully understand the aura and personality of Graham Souness, especially if you've grown up watching him on Sky. He's a little bit of an older gentleman now. When he was in his early 30s, when he arrived at Rangers, there was something of the Hollywood star about Graham Souness. I think the book really captures. Hopefully people read it and start to get a sense of just how big a deal Souness was when he walked into a room.
Yeah. You say Hollywood star there, Johnny. I mean, it's Tom Selleck. I mean, he is Magnum PI. He pretty much looked like that at the time. Yeah. I don't think, even with Steven Gerrard, Walter had his own thing going on. I mean, Brendan Rodgers, I suppose, had a kind of charisma about him. I don't think Scottish football scene, and as a manager anyway, anything remotely close to Souness, and that kind of aura and impact and power coming through a room. And it was this. There was a point where Souness was player, manager, and director. He'd invested 600 grand of his own money into Rangers, and it was this very typical late 80s southeast of England force of nature. I can do everything, and I will do everything, and I will do everything really, really well. Lunches for wimps, 4 hours sleep a night will do. That kind of attitude.
Gordon Gekko stylings.
Yeah, very much. But force of nature is pretty much how you would describe him. He wasn't the best football manager, as his career would go on, I think, to show that Walter Smith was a better manager. I don't think that's particularly controversial. But again, at the perfect opportunity, and this is the other thing that I hope the book comes through, that you can't go back in history and just lift archetypes like that. I said, well, we need that because that was successful. What was successful then at that particular moment in time where Rangers really couldn't go much lower for the state of play at the time, and absolutely needed that force of nature. They needed someone who would just accept no other point of view, really. Such single-minded focus.
It's interesting to me that more generally, Martyn, the club has been successful with those type of characters at the helm, and what that says about the club itself.
I noticed last year when Gio was doing okay, that actually I think we kind of flip from that fire of Souness to something a bit more reserved in Walter Smith. Oh, he's been too lax though, in discipline's dreadful. We need the disciplinarian again. We need the little general, and we get Advocate, who was great and then set fire to everything. And well, what do you need? You need someone who's just a great man manager and a bit of cool. So you bring McLeish in, and then we get to stage. No, we need a figurehead. We need someone who's really going to rip this up. Steven Gerrard, and then someone just a wee bit calmer, a wee bit cooler. So we have tended to kind of switch from that, and because the reality is, the situation probably calls for the two things at various times. One thing I would say about Souness, in his defence, in terms of his managerial talent and career, one thing that he was kind of derided on after he left Rangers was his signings and his record in the transfer market. Famously, the Ali Dai from George Weah's cousin, he get told on the phone and whatever. His record at Rangers is superb. Things didn't work out; they went for profit usually. The big signings, the two he was very unlucky with because Netsov and West, but his big ones paid off. And what he was also good at was just getting someone in, do a job, great, move on. And I don't know how that disappeared, whether the market disappeared, I'm not sure. But that was, if you chose your best 11 of Souness' signs compared to Walter's, I think he'd be hard to beat.
Yeah. I thought it was fascinating again that you look at Souness through a sort of Thatcherite lens, which is interesting to me, especially because a few years ago I made a podcast about Souness and Aggie Moffat, that famous incident at McDiarmid Park, which you obviously touch on as well in the book. And I always thought wider Scotland looked at that through a lens of Thatcherism versus traditional Labour values. So it was interesting to hear from a Rangers perspective a look back at that idea as opposed to from a negative perspective. I just wonder if you could kind of touch on that and your feelings on it.
This was one of the most interesting chapters of the book, actually, for me as a writer and just researching and whatever. Souness was unashamed Thatcherite. He did not hide that. And that's why Rangers sitting in Liverpool, Glasgow and Liverpool, not hotbeds of Thatcherism, it's probably fair to say. But even within Scotland, he was respected, not loved. I think that's probably fair. Even at Liverpool, I don't think he was completely loved. Douglas would have been. Because he had that arrogance and swagger and abrasive ambition. Again, Tina, there is no other alternative. It's me, my way or the highway kind of thing. So that was there's a really interesting picture, cartoon in the Evening Times when he arrived, on the day he arrived. That pictured them with this kind of bag of money and IOUs and a handbook to Scottish football, a list of grounds, because he'd obviously never kicked a ball in league club football here, and he's wearing a Gucci suit and a bottle of Brut, which apparently was the height of cosmopolitanism.
That made me laugh. That made me laugh. That one.
And just a badge that says "I love me," and it was this. Not to be trusted, really. This flashy. That's really what it was, wasn't it? So he absolutely was that. But the revolution was Thatcherite. It was abrasive. It was ambitious. It was speculate to accumulate. It was built with debt, but responsible debt, and build it and they will come, because they were not coming at this particular moment. The tendencies were obviously horrendous. It was ruthless. It was the sacred cows were, line them up in terms of traditional practices. We will rip them up. We'll rip them up eventually. The biggest, of course, being on the 10th of July, 1989. But it was, I don't care how you feel about that, because this is right. And this is the way it has to be in order to be successful. So all of that was clear to me anyway. I knew that anyway. What was interesting was David Holmes's role in that, because he was ruthless in the boardroom before all this kind of came about. He was behind all this as well. But he's an old Labour man. He toyed with the idea of standing for council, I think, ostensibly. And it's this ostensible part and the real world that I think that tension is really what the 80s is about, because it's a hell of a lot more complicated than Ghost Town, or Two Tribes kind of underscoring this whole, any documentary you see on it. And going back to the fanzines and reading them all, the tensions there right from the start are really, really interesting. This fear and distrust about the fat cats and the
Camel Coat Brigade.
Camel Coat Brigade,
which I don't really understand that kind of idea. Is that about the tan jackets?
Yeah, the kind of Arthur Daly, just businessmen, really. Where were you 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah.
And more importantly, really, am I still going to get tickets? That's really what that was about, is a fear that all of this success will, where were these people? But I always get tickets for any game I wanted when there was only, when Rangers were garbage. So there was such an interesting tension between, what's happening to the club? What are we losing here? Do you trust these spivs, Barrow Boy spivs, Souness and Murray, and a lot worse, but they're bringing success, and that I think that's a kind of fascinating thing, and that's the story really of the country, that people would outwardly bemoan that bloody woman and this dreadful government and the way the country's going. But they are earning more, and they have more stuff. And you could bemoan, I don't know, the state of British industry and manufacturing and the economy, whilst driving your German car back to watch American sitcoms on your Japanese television. How people lived, the choices they made, I think, is a far more telling sign than what they say they believe in, and how they show that, how they identify themselves. That's kind of how we would describe it now. And this whole Rangers thing, I think, is the 80s in microcosm, because it's the Tory government couldn't have come up with a better application of Thatcherism than Graham Souness and David Holmes, right on Red Clydeside.
Yeah, fascinating. One of the things that I want to drill into, Martyn, is obviously, as part of the research on this book, you've spent quite a lot of time in the Mitchell Library, or on various sites, giving you traditional newspapers going back 30, 40 years, obviously. And so much of what was in there really grabbed me from a media point of view, as you might expect. So forgive the navel-gazing, folks. I'm sorry about this, but it really does interest me. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of people watching this who grew up with the papers as a cornerstone of their lives. In the morning, it certainly was something that was a big part of mine. I just want to touch on a couple of things. There's a load of unbelievable quotes. This one really grabbed me, from Alan Davison in an Evening Times match report talking about Celtic Rangers game, said, "To the victors, the spoils; to the losers, a sense of injustice that has hovered over them like some maiden aunt for the best part of a century." That's a wonderful bit of writing, more than anything else. Acute, piercing, but also thought-provoking. What did you think going back, looking at the journalism of yesteryear? Because I've quite strong feelings on this, because I think current journalists coming through, they often get this sense of being battered around the head by what journalism used to be, when we're all, going through the papers every morning and consuming it so passionately. It's a different world that we live in now, and the media is so very, very different to those times. But those guys really could write, couldn't they? Or a lot of them could.
Yeah, you had a turn of phrase that was a bit more it was well crafted. I'm not sure you see that now. Don't get me wrong. There were others, or there were others at the time who spoke in tabloid English. I think I imagine just on a daily basis. It's hilarious how they framed conversations with players, because there's no way Chris Woods gave you that quote. There's no way he spoke like that, chick. Come on. But there were others that you mentioned, and that quote is, the more things change, eh? But there was room for that. All right, I think there was space, or it appears there was space. A match report was a thing, because it needed to be a thing, I guess, because, well, you would maybe have seen it on Sports Scene that night, or the night before, or you're going to see it on Scott Sport on tea time, or at tea time on the Sunday. But you know, unless you were there, you're not seeing the 90 minutes really. So it was important to convey, and not just convey the action, but to convey something a bit bigger than that. I'm not sure that's. I am sure that's not the case anymore, because we consume the thing ourselves. We don't need anyone to tell that story. So maybe there's a lost art because there's not the necessity. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I spent some time for a project looking back at some old copies of the Daily Record for over a period in the 80s and the 90s, and it was always fascinating working in that building. You could go down to the archive room and just go through it, and I would find myself lost, go down for half an hour and then end up being down there for 2.5 hours. I'll have a look at the mid-90s, or I'll have a look at the late 80s. And one of the things that struck me looking back at the Daily Record on the day that Maurice Johnston signed for Rangers was how little actual copy there was in these papers, because now they feel that they have to pack papers out with content to make them good value, to encourage people to feel like, oh Christ, I better keep reading this thing. Whereas back then, they didn't have to do that. So I think the Daily Record, if my memory serves me correct, had 4 pages at front of book about Maurice Johnston and 4 pages at the back. If that happened today, it's similar. I mean, you can't actually, there's no modern example where it would be similar. But still, to only have 8 pages on something like that, I mean, it would be 25 pages. And for me, it was a big lesson in just how different things are when you've also got maybe 1/10 of the staff that the Daily Record would have had in those days. Fascinating differences in the landscape.
Yeah, there's a lot of changes. So your argument was that in terms of the quotes from that particular press conference, that there was hardly anything really there. So it was more commentary.
No, so it wasn't the day of the press conference. It was the day where it was. No, sorry, I'm getting myself mixed up here. The presser was maybe a spread, so it was like maybe one article. But in terms of the rest, like the fallout, the reaction, there's very little. It was just basic hotline reaction. But I suppose what I'm trying to say is the expectations in the 24-hour media age are vastly different. And from a journalistic point of view, you've got much less staff to do much more content. So part of that thing that I was talking about like Alan Davison being a wordsmith, they had time to work on their craft in those days. That they didn't have a lot to do. So that's
So
to me
less is
is
more.
a major part of it, but less is more.
Yeah, and I would wholeheartedly agree with that. And even now we're sounding very much like two old men, Johnny, but we're you're providing a platform here. There of course are others, but it's fighting against the grain for long form writing, and someone with the time and space to look at something from a wider lens, in a lot more depth, and to just go off and write about what you want, really, or approach a current affair in a kind of different way. And I do worry that because of the absolute incessant need for bang, 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 it has to be short and it has to be there. That we're just selling. I think we're selling the market short a wee bit. I think we've dumbed down far too much. Which when you do read something, you do read two sentences put together that are very nicely done. It reads like McIlvanney now, because it doesn't get that time and space anymore.
Yeah. One of the other aspects that I thought was really interesting was the way that you weave in the sort of transfer links of the era. The what might have beens, I found them particularly tantalising, Martin. Now, a lot of them I'm aware of, a lot of them I've forgotten. There was one sentence where I think you talked about Rangers being linked with Hoddle, Dixon, Archibald, and Sharp. It's essentially the equivalent of Rangers being linked with someone like Foden, Harry Kane. We're talking about the absolute creme de la creme. You go on later in the book, there's Pallister, there's other players. I think by the time you get to the second book, you'll be talking about Gianluca Vialli and people like that. It's remarkable compared to today, just the level of possibility that existed around Rangers. And I suppose that's the joy of writing this.
It was. I mean, I think as I say, even fans knew that Italy was at a different level. We weren't really going to reach that. We're certainly going to reach it instantly, but everything else was pretty much fair game, especially England. And what I hope I've conveyed, because it was genuine around certainly this book and this particular era, and certainly the start of this particular era, was that it was felt that Rangers could sign anybody and win anything. And it wasn't that we could win the European Cup, it was we will. This is what's in the plan. This is what's going to happen. And that level of excitement after 10 years or whatever, or 9 years of very much the opposite. And I think Jock Wallace's transfer targets for if he'd been kept on in the summer of '86 would have been Gordon Durie, John Brown, who obviously went on to be stalwarts, but were still quite young at the time, and Craig Levein, another up and coming, young, promising Scottish player. It's not Terry Butcher though, is it? So that level of thinking, and Butcher and Woods, of course, was the first, but that just then it just sparked off this belief that this guy, the Rangers were going to operate in a different way. They were going to be ambitious. They were going to allow to use Denton that way. And then you've got a stadium which looks like something nearly the 21st century, when your closest rival stadium looks barely out the 19th. And you've got this guy, this manager, who, I mean, Butcher, for example, he met him in London. He come back from LA. He was playing in the Europe against the rest of the world after the World Cup. I'll meet you there, right? There was a bit of a mix-up, actually, but they got together. Butcher thought he was just going to have a chat and then go home, think about it, and Souness had him on a plane up to Edinburgh. He didn't even get a chance to go home to the family. Up to Edinburgh, across to the stadium. He wanted to show him this place. And that kind of charisma, all of these things, and what can English clubs offer apart from tradition? Because they can't offer European football. right, the world's an oyster now. It really is everything is aligning. And hopefully I've captured that excitement, because excitement is what it was. Maybe I can't express it enough. That really, there has never been a time like it for Rangers anyway.
No, I think you certainly do capture that. Just final point on the media, and I think this kind of brings it back into today in a way. One of the stories you talk about in the chapter, where you kind of focus a little bit more on the media of the time, you talk about some of the characters that were around there, is Jerry McNee, and the fact that he sort of dehumanized Paul Gascoigne to the point that he just refused to call him by his name and referred to him as number 8. And then you contrast that by talking about the famous commentary that McNee did on the 8-in-a-row clincher against Aberdeen at Ibrox, the 3-1 game where Gaza grabbed the hat-trick. I think your quote is that his commentary is passionate and energised. I wondered, given that you say that it was almost as if it was all an act. I wonder if you think that it's interesting that football culture, a quarter of the century on, we still have pundits who are kind of following this similar trajectory. I would say I think you're right about that, about the act element to it, about the theatre of it, and I think that's fine in 1990, whatever it was, 1996. But we're now in 2023, and I just wondered if you feel that that's an interesting and valid comparison to make.
I think it is. I mean, I think it was all an act. McNee didn't like him. I think that's fair. What he would do, of course, is call him. The number 8 thing actually came about the season after that, but he would have it in from you talk about Gascoigne every week, with a lot of invective in his Sunday Mail column in the morning, and then in the afternoon he's calling a game perfectly. There's not a hint of dejection or bitterness. There was a wee bit at Wembley that summer when he was commentating that game for STV, but that's a different story, probably understandable. But when he's calling that game, it's natural. And there's probably a bit of McNee that he wanted to be the story himself, or he wanted to be part of history himself. So why would he underplay one of the most famous individual performances we've seen in that kind of moment in Scotland? So there would be a professionalism that kind of kicked there, but everything's inflated for sure. You get a lot of that. Nothing new by that time. I think the 70s, 80s, guys like Clough, when they were on TV, would ham it up. I'm pretty sure you would get quite up, because it's still entertainment, isn't it? It's still, and that's I guess that's the line you want to cross properly, Johnny. It's being entertaining, it's being engaging without being a pantomime, which he bordered on. In fact, he didn't border on. He absolutely jumped straight in with the number 8 thing. But today it's far too common. Far too common up here. I'm not sure if we get it down south. Anytime I watch coverage of the Premier League or whatever, there are opinions. I mean, Keane and Souness, funnily enough, are a wee bit like that, but you could see at least a grain in there of an argument. For up here, it's still that kind of, it's a tribal pantomime.
Yeah, it's more fringe down there, isn't it? If you look at someone like TalkSport, they'll have people on there that are at the wind-up. But that's not the absolute mainstream. On Sky Sports, it's much more serious. BT's coverage, much more serious. Whereas I think there's a sense up here that the culture needs this. But I think they're feeding the culture. I don't think it's the other way around.
Well, I'm fascinated by this, and I think it's maybe a topic for another book, but I'm fascinated by how we consume the game, and that was one of the things, wasn't it? And one of the chapters about how the changes in how we consume the sport as fans, from so little live television to wallpaper everywhere, from the best leagues in the world, and therefore how then do we view Rangers as the 1990s goes on, and we're then far more critical because you don't look like that, whereas in 86 to 91 anyway, certainly 92, you're a lot more protected. So how we consume the game has changed, and how does that affect our expectations, our demands, our understanding, and then how does that shape the game in turn? So is there a relationship between how the game is portrayed, how fans absorb that, consume that, and then how fans demand, ask, understand what's in front of them, and how various different national games have been shaped by that discourse, by that conversation? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Right, we're going to touch on just finally, Martyn, because I don't want to keep you here for 3 hours, but we've covered so much, and hopefully people are getting a real idea about what this book is going to be like. Just finally, we can't really finish this conversation without talking about the chapter on Maurice Johnson, because it's such an epoch-defining moment for Scottish football, and especially for Rangers. There's obviously some elements to this that we look back on with 2023 eyes, and there's no escaping that some elements of it are probably quite difficult now, with the way modern society has evolved. But there's a lot of context, I think, that you need to give, and I think the chapter does that absolutely brilliantly. How do you feel looking back on it overall, over the coverage, over the idea, and over how it shaped the modern Rangers?
I think it shaped the modern Rangers in a different way than we maybe think. Obviously, it broke that barrier and it allowed Rangers then access to sign whomever they wished, and we end the decade with, or the next decade with, an Italian treble winning captain, right? So it's not just pushing that door to a new market ajar; it's blown it off its hinges. It was the most sensational day in Scottish football history. I think it was Brian Wilson, the MP, Labour MP, Celtic fan, and kind of always a lot of pressure, understandably, on Rangers to change their policy, and he asked the question, what will the signing kind of do for Scottish society? What can that do to improve things? I would have suggested, or I have suggested in the book, that Scottish society had changed, therefore this signing could happen. I think that's the part that people missed. If this or a comparable signing was made by Rangers in 1959, there would have been riots, I think. There would have been genuine boycotts, because that identity was so important, so ingrained. The role of the church, the role of religion in people's lives for the first 60 years, maybe the 20th century Scotland, was so important that just couldn't have been accepted. But things had changed. You got a lot of mixed marriage, you got relaxation of employment legislation, or improvement of employment legislation, and society's changing to a stage where it's all a wee bit, go back to the point earlier, sensational and pantomime. It's a lot of words, a lot of strong words at the time, and there was a lot of feeling. But again, I go back to the kind of Thatcher point. What did people do? Not what they said, not what noise they made. What did they do? And attendances continue to rise. Rangers continue to be successful. It didn't actually matter. Now, what the modernity that I think that the signing represented actually was that Johnson could have taken an easy way out, could have gone back to Celtic, some bridges to mend. He didn't leave on the best of terms, but I'm sure that could have been done. And it was a relatively quiet life, blah, blah, blah. But he chose not to. He chose to endure or take on a lot of risk, personal risk to his safety, his family's safety, for money and medals. That's a professional football. And the other thing, and this is why Rangers read the policy or the practice, whatever you want to call it. It was legally wrong and morally wrong. But where Rangers could kind of defend it was on a pragmatic basis. Okay, we could sign a Roman Catholic, we could sign lots of them, but are they really going to want to play for Rangers? Really? I mean, there's one thing signing a player, and there's one thing that player playing well or giving the all. And you know Rangers, Jonny, as well as I do. Effort is valued pretty much above all else, right? But Johnston gave everything for at least those 2 seasons, the first 2 seasons. And that's the modernity, that's the professional. All that noise, all these imagined communities and imagined sensationalism and controversy. Where can I earn more? I want to come home to Scotland, which is what he did. He wanted to come back with his family. Where am I going to earn more? Where am I going to win more? That suits me. I'll sign that, and I will give everything. This is the guy who a couple of years ago had written how much he hated Rangers. He's a Celtic man through and through. It's all nonsense. It's all garbage. It is about sheer cold-blooded professionalism, and that's what the 1990s were going to be about. And that's what the Johnston thing symbolised more than anything else. And it just symbolised that Rangers, again, were modernising. Not about that kind of baggage, although, of course, it was important. But we will sign. I don't care. Are they good for us? Will they do us a turn? Are they worth the money? We'll pay it. And I don't care how you feel about it. We're paying it.
Sorry, I'm interrupting you there. Martyn, thank you very much for your input today. It's been fascinating to talk about this book. Can you tell us a little bit about where it is available? Because I will put obviously a link into the description, etc., for people if they can go. But I'm assuming it's available for a number of outlets, and when it's out.
It'll be out on the 14th of March. It'll be available everywhere you find your books. It'll be on Kindle as well, or ebook, however you do that. If you do that, it is available at the moment for pre-sale on heartland.co.uk/revolution. So if you wish a signed copy, then or you want to have that pre-order and get it for the 14th, then that's where to get it. But yeah, where you normally get your stuff, but help an author out and buy direct would be my request. But yeah, I hope you do buy it. I hope you, more importantly, you enjoy it and think maybe a wee bit differently about this incredible time in Rangers history.
And of course, part 2 will be coming in time for Christmas.
Hopefully for Christmas. I've done there's about 110,000 words done. So the main part of it is done. I've just got those 6 kind of smaller chapters to start writing, hopefully finish by May, and hopefully finish or think of a title. 112,000 words, no problem. Thinking of one or two is a wee bit more difficult. The second act is harder to distill than the first one. For all the chaos, Jonny, you've read it. It seems like some drama every week in this period, but I think you can make that narrative thread that Rangers pushing forward and new horizons, barriers being smashed, everything can be done. Rangers absolutely streaming forward. The second part, you've got the same amount of trophies, same amount of titles, the greatest ever season, 2 of the greatest players, if not the 2 greatest players ever played for Rangers, the famous 9 in a row, all of this, but this feeling that there's a bigger party elsewhere, there's bigger revolutions that have taken place, and Rangers aren't quite part of that. And how does this feel? And that tension of looking more insular and looking back the way, which is of course what we did to try and match what Celtic did before. There's a hint of turning back rather than pushing forward, and that's more interesting, but it's hard to distill. So still a wee bit of work to be done, but hopefully for Christmas.
Fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to that. I'm sure this is going to be a roaring success. I absolutely loved it. So congratulations. It's a really, really fine piece of work, and I think it's going to be seminal when it comes to how people look back on this period. So thanks very much to Martyn Ramsey. Thank you all for watching. Obviously, you have the link in the description. I've stuck that in there if you want to go and pre-order the book. And you know you can get it everywhere when it does come out. So once again, thanks for everyone. Thanks to Martyn, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.